Hi everyone. Okay, well, I am going to do a little painting for you today again. I just got back from 10 days of teaching in Rome, which was a lot of work, but pretty amazing. And my head is just filled with inspiration, ideas, contradictions. Promise. So anyway, I'm going to do a painting, yes, but the thrust of this, or the intent of this, is to talk really about ways of establishing perspective in our work. So I hesitated because I was trying to think of a good way to explain the way I'm going to hopefully do that well. And I think this may look complex. It's not. It's really a relatively simple idea. It's an all-interior view, so we're seeing only elements of the built environment. No sky, no trees, no water, and literally no floor and no ceiling. It's a stairway, clearly you can see from my drawing. But I thought it would be a good vehicle to discuss this idea of perspective. The illusion of perspective that we often want to create in our drawings or paintings. And that, of course, is the almost, I think, not almost, literally magical effect of creating the feeling of three-dimensionality, depth within our work. I always say this because it's true, but when we're painting or drawing, we have only two dimensions, height, width. Everything we do within those four corners to create this sense of three-dimensionality, a foreground, a midground, a background, I think is magic, and it's something worth looking at, even if it's not necessarily your focus, as it might be for me. It's definitely worth thinking about, even if you paint only botanicals or completely abstract. That sense of one thing appearing to be in front of another thing, of some things appearing to be nearer the viewer, while other things appear to be further away, even if those things are just shapes or pure atmosphere. I think it's, as a painter, I think those are questions well worth asking. So what I really mean by all that is the idea of perspective is not just something that holds true if you're drawing or painting architectural scenes, although it certainly can. It's just as true if you're painting, like I say, a still life, an abstract, a portrait, figure drawings, anything whatsoever, that illusion of three-dimensionality. So I'll get into the specifics of this in a moment, but I want to just briefly sorry, I'm trying to multitask. I was saying that to my group in Italy is I have a skill to be able to draw and paint and talk at the same time, but I'm not always convinced how well I do either one. But what I was going to say is, for me, over the years, two main ways have developed in my work, in my way of thinking about my work. Two main ways of establishing that illusion of perspective, depth, and three-dimensionality. One is probably the more commonly understood or accepted way, and that is by use of the horizon line, perspective points, the more mathematical, the more line-based way of establishing that illusion of perspective. And I've got that going on here too. I have a pretty straightforward two-point perspective, meaning there's a horizon line. That's the line of sight where you, the artist, you establish that line where you're standing. So I'm standing further down this set of stairs. So if I were shown in the image, which I'm not, my head would fall on that horizon line. There's a figure here, of course. She's up a few steps from where I am. There's a couple here. They're up quite a few steps from where I am and she is. So between the horizon line, this figure, that grouping, you start to begin to understand the perspective as a layering of objects receding into space. I do have a more technical video here on YouTube about drawing in perspective, which if you're interested, you could check out. And I've written about it in some of my books and DVDs, and in my online course with terracotta. It's all over the place. I love teaching perspective just because I think it's fun, yes, but because I just think it's a useful tool, not a mathematical set of rules, but it's a very useful tool for an artist, as I say, working in any style or medium, to be able to play around with and create other layers of mystery or narrative or emotional power within the work. So it's not an attempt to make your work more accurate technically. It's a set of skills that you can easily develop to make your work more evocative, more communicative. So the one maybe primarily understood way of creating this illusion of three dimension in your work is the mathematical, technical way. The horizon line, vanishing points, one is here. So everything on this side recedes to that line, to that point. There's a second vanishing point way out into space, but that one I just guessed at where elements in this plane would recede much further away, so the angles are more gentle, much less acute. This vanishing point is quite close, so these angles for everything in this plane to the left is far more angled, far more acute. But anyway, the mathematical line-based way of establishing the illusion of perspective is one. The second, I think, more emotionally communicative, more evocative way to establish illusion of perspective is by the layering of values. So I did a sketch based on my reference photo. I have two reference photos, both close to each other, same space. But I made some changes. I opened it up a bit more. I gave a little bit more negative space, a little bit more breathing room for some of the shadows I intend to paint. And then I did a value study based on the kind of image that I want to create. So what you can see here is, I hope you can see, is I'm trying to design my values that I'm going to be using in the final painting. I always work in a design of three basic values. One being the lightest light, often saved white paper or close to it. Two, the whole family of mid-tone values. And three, the darkest darks. Very often where your darkest darks meet your lightest lights, that's where the eye of the viewer is going to go. The eye is almost always first attracted by contrast. So where the darkest dark meets the lightest light, here, 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 this area, that's going to be your center of focus. It doesn't have to be a point. It can be an area, a region in your painting. But if you want to create this illusion of depth, it's probably best to locate it in a plane, a foreground, a midground, or a background plane. In this case, I'm using the foreground of the painting. So I'm collecting these columns, the base, the shadow they cast, the figure leaning over the balustrade here, all as one connected dark shape to form the foreground of my painting. The light that I want to have bleeding in from behind the colonnade spilling out here over these graceful steps will be the lightest light. So the lightest light meets the darkest dark. That forms your center of interest. But all the light I'm putting in the midground of the painting. The background of the painting, regardless of what the reference photo may show, I'm making all a range of midtones. So midtone, light, dark, a very solid value design that works for me very often. Each basic value shape is assigned a spatial location in the painting. So in this case, there are other options available, but in this case, the midtones fall in the background, the lights fall in the midground, the darks fall in the foreground. I always design my paintings, as I say, with three basic values, one being light, two being midtone, three being dark. And then generally, there's a million exceptions, but often, I guess I'd say, I assign a spatial relationship, A being foreground, B being midground, C being background. I will assign a value to each of these spatial relationships. Yeah, of course there are variations within the darks, there are variations within the lights and the midtones. These aren't just cookie cutter one values, but I'm just saying the family of darks, in this case, will belong to the foreground. The family of lights will belong in the midground, and the family of midtones will fall in the background. And I think overall it'll organize the visual elements, the perspectively drawn visual elements, the understood shapes of architecture, and it will design the values to help create a convincing illusion of foreground, midground, background, and then married up with the perspective lines, horizon, vanishing points, etc., and the construction lines I used on the architectural elements. You will understand this painting when done to be an exercise in dimensionality and perspective. For anyone curious where we are, this is in Rome. This is inside the Palazzo Barberini. It's a magnificent Baroque palace built for the Barberini family in the 1600s. They were, not surprisingly, vastly wealthy. Anyway, interestingly, for those of us interested in architectural detail, or even if not, because they're so beautiful, at either end of this palace, which is now a great museum of art, there are these ceremonial stairs. At one end, this stair, the so-called square staircase, built roughly 1630, and the artist was the great Gian Lorenzo Bernini, mostly known today as being a sculptor. His work is breathtaking. It's all over Rome. It's all over the world, actually, but primarily in Rome. So he made his mark as a sculptor, but he was an architect and I think he was a painter as well. Just to flesh out the story, at the other end of the Palazzo Barberini is sort of a mirrored staircase, not mirrored visually, but spatially. One end, the other end. It was designed and built by another great Baroque artist, architect, Barberini, and we are led to believe that the two men were rivals. I don't know how much of that is hype or true, but I could imagine it. They were often considered for similar commissions. So the other stairway is in many ways even more beautiful than this. It's an elliptical stair, which at some point I'll probably do a painting of as well, but it is very sculptural, unbelievably difficult to build, I could imagine, let alone to just design. But anyway, here we are at the square staircase of Bernini. I laid this out a little bit earlier. I did use straight edges just to speed things up. I want to do a looser painting than that. I don't want to be too rigid here. It is a very architectural scene, so I think I can get away with, if you want to put it that way, a little bit more rigidity or architectonics, but I really want this to be a study in light, not about architecture. Which brings me to the other big point, why I love this space and spaces like this. Architecture is often thought of as solid and object-based, which it often is, but really it's a choreography between what is solid, what is object, and what is open space. So positive, negative space. This particular stairway is just such a beautiful study in that. Open space or negative space, closed space or positive shape. And this dialogue between solid, void, solid, void, solid, void, all in this three-dimensional composition, I just think is glorious. And to that end, one reason I wanted to do this without any sky showing or the floor showing was really to concentrate the viewer's attention on that dance between positive and negative shape. And the whole idea of climbing up a stair is, well, childish of me perhaps, but I'm just fixated with stairways, roadways, bridges. As a painter, they are all opportunities for us to tell stories about the passing of time, passing from one place to another. They're just dripping with meaning and symbolism and narrative and excitement. Okay, so I'm going to do this probably tonally, color story-wise, very much like the photograph. So it's going to be very low, very, very limited palette painting, just golds, oranges, perhaps off reds, warm tones. And I will, in the shadow area, very likely work in some darker, cool tones of teals and blues. But overall, it's going to be a dialogue between blues and browns or warms and cools. It's really about the shift in light. That's the lesson I hope to get across, and the layering of values. So I don't want to use too much color that will start to obscure that meaning. Flipping it upside down, because I know I want to isolate the light here. So this is the first part of almost every painting I do. I call it just carve the light. Isolate the light where I want it, and then begin darkening other areas. In watercolor, I'm asked very often how I paint light, and the answer is I don't. We don't. You don't paint light in watercolor. In a transparent medium, what we do is we reveal the light. So we paint the shades and the shadows that reveal the light, because all the light in this transparent medium is transmitted by the pure white untouched paper beneath. So these are just fairly light mid-tone washes. I used a little bit of permanent orange, but there's a bit of Naples yellow in there as well. Some raw umber here in the center. And this is a bit of sepia right at the top. I'm painting on a piece of Arches paper, 140 pound, 300 gram, rough surface, my favorite. And I'm using one of my signature brushes, these beautiful mop series, Thomas W. Schaller mops by Neef. I guess it's a shameless plug, but they are great brushes, and you should have in your arsenal 1 or 2 or 3 mop brushes. They hold a lot of water, really great for doing these quick graded, very smooth washes. I don't know another kind of brush that's as successful at doing them. But whether you buy mine or not doesn't matter, but you should have one or two mop brushes. The kind of wash that was just an old school graded wash popularized by the French Beaux-Arts. But it's really just a matter of building up a fairly large bead of pigmented water and pulling it down the page. You can lighten it, you can darken it, you can change the color or the tone or the value by dropping pigments into that bead as it comes down. It does take a little practice to get on to that technique, but honestly, not much. Most anyone can pick it up. I did it upside down because I'm painting on a slanted easel. Another thing I really constantly urge painters to do, which is to explore gravity. If you work wet as I do, and it is a fluid medium, you should take advantage of the ability of gravity to work for you and make your job easier. I'm doing a very similar wash along the bottom of the painting, all of which I think you can begin to see clearly now. It's isolating the light in this area, toning out the top, and now toning out the bottom of the painting with fairly light, moving into mid-tone, into middle mid-tones, dropping a little violet into the bottom because this area is going to get very dark before I'm done. But at this stage, I just want to gently grade the painting from pure white through mid-tone into what will be dark here at the bottom. Again, if you use gravity, you can tilt the board up or down to increase the flow or decrease the flow. You can inverse it if you want to add a little more pigment. This is a bit risky to do, but it can work. And then re-reverse it. And what that does, brings some of the legs of this bead of water up into the slightly lighter parts of the painting. Give it a great deal of gravity in the reverse, and you get a much smoother overall look. So, if any of you have watched my other videos or DVDs or anything before, you probably know that I build my paintings up from the lightest light. The lightest light is the saved untouched paper. So I start in with my light midtones, move into my middle midtones. My darkest darks generally are the last to go, the last things to be painted. And in this case, not every case, but it brings me to this other bit of tip or advice I like to give. Very often, if you want something to appear far away, it's going to have less color, it'll be less saturated, less bright, less value, but also will tend to have softer edges, less definition, less detail, softer edges. Something that you want to read very close to the viewer will have deeper values often, more saturation of color, value, and crisper, harder, more defined edges. I say that, and it is true, but I should qualify it by saying it can be true. It is not the only solution. There are many paintings I do where the foreground is not the darkest, doesn't have the hardest edges. There may be cases where you want the viewer's eye to skip over the foreground, land in the midground. In that case, you'd play down the foreground, play up the midground or the background. But for this painting, the foreground will be the darkest, so it will have more color, more value, more saturation, crisper, harder edges, and psychologically, I think, that will just make it feel to the viewer that things up here are more in focus, more crisp, more clear, and therefore closer to us, all of which will help enhance this illusion of perspective, which is the goal for the day. So I dislike using the hairdryer, but I'm going to just to speed the process. I dislike the hairdryer because I don't like the noise, but mostly if you hit a very wet wash with the hairdryer, the tendency will be for the pigment to blow out of the little divots in the paper, and you can create streaks, dull, dry. Your washes will dry with much less luminosity than they will if you just let it air dry naturally. But I don't have that luxury. I don't know if I should go into this cul-de-sac topic or not, but it seems to be coming up a lot recently. Taping down your paper or not. Many artists don't. They wet the whole paper, put it down on a board, work on it in that way. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. I tend to tape my paper down, maybe out of habit. I paint so much on site, plein air, that it just helps keep it more in place. I think if you work on a tilt with some gravity, you're not going to get those deep buckles and streaks and blobs that you might get if you worked more flat in a very wet way. Also, the paper does expand a bit when it's quite wet. You can see it has some ripples. They don't tend to bother me much, and the paper will dry perfectly flat. So I don't know. I'm not saying anyone's wrong and I'm right. I just find it a quicker, more expedient way of painting, at least at a small scale. This painting is only a quarter sheet, so not very big at all. When I'm doing my more formal or larger studio pieces, they're full sheets generally or larger. Those I will soak the paper and staple it to a stretcher. Very old-fashioned, but it works. And even pieces half a sheet size or up, I will tend to stretch, and then what I meant was I staple them down to a stretcher, the large sheets. So from about a half sheet size up, I tend to worry about it a bit more than a quarter size sheet. I just, for me, don't find very much difficulty in taping it off and painting it. And again, it will dry perfectly flat. So what I'm doing here is just very light tones of raw umber and some yellow ochre and a mid-sized flat brush. I'm just trying to indicate some identity of this stairway as it wraps around and goes up. Such a beautiful staircase. Ay, ay, ay. But my goal here is I know I'm painting into the area that I want to keep most light, so I'm using very little paint, very little detail, and very little saturation. And here and there I'm making the edges a little less crisp and clear, because I hope that when I'm done and I contrast this kind of painting to the crisper, darker painting here and definitely here, that will make that assembly of columns, etc., feel further away. That and the desaturated colors will help enhance this illusion of perspective overall. So it's a lot of words. Basically, the less I do back here, the better. I'm often asked, do I worry about the pencil lines showing through? Almost never do I worry about that. And again, I don't want to come across as saying that's the right way to paint. I don't believe that in general, that there is a right way or a wrong way to do most anything, to be honest. I think, does it work for you? Drawing is so integral to my process that I don't mind if the pencil construction lines, the sketch lines, if I'm painting plein air, if they show through. I don't mind. Not only do I not mind, I want them to. There are other kinds of paintings where that might not be true for me, but for this kind of painting, it's a little reliant on the drawing, so I don't see any reason to want to deny that or to hide it. When I'm all done, and I want to really brighten up this area behind the standing figure, I can imagine I'll go in with an eraser when this is all dry and try to lighten some of those lines, but not to deny the lines, but just to brighten the area. That I will do regularly, but it isn't because I hate the pencil lines showing through. It'll just be because I want to brighten an area even more than it might be. So I hope I'm clear. I don't want to come across as someone who says you should or you shouldn't do this or do that. I just don't believe in that way of thinking. Art in general, but I think almost watercolor specifically is so adaptable to individualistic ways of expression and ways of painting. It's a beautiful quality it has, but it doesn't lend itself to hard and fast rules so much, and that's good. It's liberating. I teach a lot. There are students who often really want me to tell them the rules or to say, do this, don't do that, because they're just learning, they're just finding their way. So I get it, and I feel almost badly I can't do that. But I do think there are rules of thumb, practices and methods, techniques perhaps that often work, and that's the way I like to phrase it. But as you get better at expressing yourself and figuring out what you like to paint and conversely what maybe you don't like to paint, you'll also find that a lot of the rules that this instructor or that have told you over the years, they just don't really apply to you. So anyway, I want to cut to the chase early on with everybody and just say, don't take too much advice. Find your own way. It's going to be the best. So here, I'm just trying to hint at details. I'm not trying to render or be overly specific, but I just want to hint at what's going on back here, really as a way to just animate the space a bit and introduce some overall mid-tone. In my my setup sketch, or my study here, I was playing around with the idea of a cast shadow that I might place here to help further emphasize the light here and then give me an opportunity to work in more darks up here. I think I want to do that, but I don't want to make too big of a deal out of it. Nothing terribly graphic, more subtle if anything. So I'm going to take this Escoda flat, Versatile flat, 3/4 inch, and just sort of make up a shadow that doesn't exist. So that is a little bit of that Daniel Smith permanent orange mixed with some yellow ochre. So it's yellowish, but mostly a light to mid-toned warm wash. Yeah, I think it was the thing to do. Now what I want to do is try to feather that into this whole area so it doesn't cause too much attention to itself. So I'm going to use my flat brush, scruff up some of the edges here and there, bleed it into the top of the painting a bit more. Try to make some of this architectural identity look a little more ambiguous. The reason, so the eye of the viewer doesn't get lost up here in details, but just reads what I hope will be a pleasant assembly of mid-tones. It's a little violet I'm working in too, to contrast a little with the orange and yellows. This is a fairly cheap 1/2 inch. I have some beautiful Escoda 1/2 inches, which I love to use. But for this kind of scrapey work, this synthetic brush, because it doesn't hold much water, is often well suited to the task of these dry brush marks, because it runs out of water so quickly. Rather than making a dark line, it just makes these aerated dry brush marks, which I almost always am aiming to get. Yeah, and this kind of casual informality, I think, is a nice counterpoint to all the rigidity and the architectural specifics of the rest of the space. As the painting develops, I'll be able to tell better if I think any more is needed up here, but at this stage, I think it looks pretty good. I'm going to just leave it and move on. I'll add some tone to the shade sides of these columns. For this, I'm using an 1/8 inch flat brush, also a fairly inexpensive one, with the hope that it runs out of water quickly and affords me the opportunity to make some of these beautiful dry brush marks. Yeah, it's okay. Now, these columns I'm working on, I want them to appear much more forward, frontal, than all of the stuff in the back. So, knowing that, I'm trying to use just a little less water and a little more pigment, so that subtly they begin to pull forward and start to enhance my my illusion of perspective a little better. Yeah, they're starting, not quite there. I think when we come down the stairs, we're getting closer to our center of interest, so this whole assembly wants to be a little darker. Not overall, but definitely at the bottom, so I'm going to drop in some deeper tones. This is sepia. This is another one of my Neef mop brushes, but a very small one. Great for this kind of detail. They hold a lot of water, but they also make a beautiful little point if you need it. So here, I'm getting the sense that as I get closer to the foreground, I want to drop in some complementary cool tones into all these warms. So I'm going to use a little bit of cobalt teal dropped into the sepia. And then as I get up here, I'll drop in deeper tones of blue, probably ultramarine. Dominantly, these shapes, I believe, want to read as warm, but when you can begin to pull out little complements of cool, that's another little trick you can play on the eye that makes them pull forward and create that illusion of perspective. I don't want to say this is difficult, but it's a little tricky to modulate the increasing values. The physical distance between this and this is only a couple of inches, but I want the perceived distance between them to be quite a few feet. So that's what this exercise is about. How do I do that? How do I manipulate the values to make this look farther away than that look farther away than this? And the way I'm doing it is by subtly, and I hope successfully, increasing the values and saturations on each one of these elements as they pull more forward into the composition. I'm not too worried about the dark because I can paint this all in one shape more near the end, whereas these elements are all somewhat physically connected, and so within the body of them there's a lot going on. And I want them to not be separate. I want them to be physically connected to, again, when you play up the sense of ambiguity and some mystery, that too makes things feel a little further away because the viewer's eye can't quite tell what's going on. And that, in this case, is a good thing. So I don't want this to dry. I want this to, I mean, I do eventually, of course, but for now, I want to connect it up with a shadow. I don't want to say I'm worried. I'm not too worried. I'm just, what I'm thinking about here is trying to get the shadow values as correct as I can, because they too have to get increasingly saturated as they step down the way. So this is a Daniel Smith Imperial Purple. It's a nice transparent violet, not too aggressive. But here and there, I'm dropping in a little bit of neutral tint. Well, actually there's some French Ultra in there by mistake, but turns out to be not a bad thing. So they're cooling up a little bit, which I think overall is the right move to make them feel shadowy and darker without becoming gloomy or sad. We don't want that. I do want these shadow shapes, despite the fact that they're being cast by very rectilinear, rational objects. I want them to look a little organic, I guess you'd say. Not crazy, but I think a little more fluid. The reason is I'm trying to also play around with this mix of rigidity and architectural specifics, and then some fluidity in the shadow areas, and the figures, of course, will allow a little of that too. There's no one right way to paint in watercolor, I keep saying, because it's true. But for me, I just feel like it's kind of my duty to play up the fluidity of the medium when I have the chance to do so, and not make it look too straight-lined and rigid. It's the mixture, I think, that works well. The rational with the chaotic. Yeah, overall, pretty happy with those shapes. I think that's good. This area, it's okay, but it definitely needs work. But I think it's okay to allow it to dry. Some of these unintentional blossoms and streaks really aren't that bad. I think they've sort of begun to dry in a way that makes these columns look round and also a little bit more informal. It isn't very dry. If I hated them, I'd be able to lift that very easily with a paper towel. But I think I want to live with those. I think you can see one of the things I'm struggling with in this painting, just on a philosophical level, is because it's all architecture, top to bottom, left to right, pretty straight lines. I'm struggling with not wanting the painting to look too rigid and controlled, so I'm looking for any opportunity here, the shadows, the figures, of course, to introduce a little looseness and fluidity, and what I tried to do up here as well. Just yet to be determined if that was good or bad. I think good. So far, I think good. So here you see color starting to puddle. If it concerns you that it's going to create a blotch, just tilt the board up or down, left or right, and most of those things will go away. If you get a little puddle of water that you don't want, you can pull some of the fluid out of the bristles of a soft brush and then just siphon it up. Very easy. Okay, no one area is entirely done. I think this may be done if I'm lucky. I want to do a little more work up here, but I want to wait to get all the major values established, so I'll be more easy to assess how much value or extra attention that needs, because I want to keep this area as overall pretty bright. So I think what I'll do now is drop in this major dark area. So I'm not completely done at the last stage of the painting, but this dark shape is pretty isolated, so I think there's no downside in establishing it now. I'm taking a slightly larger one of these Neef mop brushes. It's an opportunity here if I want to drop in a little color. I'll have to make my mind up pronto. Not 100% sure this painting needs it. It's just sort of an idea kind of a painting. So maybe the less going on in terms of color is good, but I'm also tempted to give her a bright red top I think a little jolt of color, if kept to a minimum, might actually be a good thing. I'm using this smallish mop brush. This is right out of the tube, neutral tint, to paint her hair, because I want her head to be one of the darkest elements in the painting, with some of the crispest edges to contrast with the lightest light. So if there is a point of major interest or focus, it would be that. But as I said earlier, it's more this whole area I want to highlight. So given that, I think the idea of giving her a little jolt of color may not be a bad move. It falls right in the bullseye of the center of interest. I'll let that red bleed up into the hair, and then the bottom of the figure I'll go back to the neutral tint and just let the red bleed into the dark. So rather than painting her as separate top and bottom and head and hair, I want to paint the whole figure at once so that all the different tones and whatever colors I use can merge together organically. It's not always the way to go, but I often think it's just a better way to portray figures on a drawing, where they don't cause too much attention to be drawn to them, but just enough. I think awkwardly what I'm saying is it's very easy to over detail figures in your drawing. And this way you can just drop in a little color into an overall wet wash, and you can imply the existence of color or the fact that she's wearing something colorful, but without having to draw little stripes or specific edges. You can be more fluid about it, which often I think looks better. Not always, but often. The other thing I don't want is for her legs to look as if they're floating. So I'm going to try to lay in some of these other dark tones to bleed in so that the top of her figure pops out nicely against the light behind, but the bottom of her figure melts gracefully, organically into the shadow areas on the steps. I should be able to pull that off. But I'll only be able to make that work if it's still wet, so that means I gotta paint a little bit faster. Oh, the stress. Yeah, but even just that much, it's quite obvious, I believe, that she looks quite forward. She's beginning to form the foreground, whereas all this begins to look in the background. And that's quite simply because of the modulation of edges and values and saturation. So it's something that can be pretty easily done. It's just not that hard if you have it in your mind that it's something you feel you want or need to do. I think a lot of things in painting we make much, much harder than they need to be because we don't understand necessarily the need to do it a different way, or we don't have an overall coherent intent. So obviously the tops of these columns I want dark, but I don't want to paint them yet, so this is just clear water. I'm going to feather that value out, which will make it a lot easier for me to come back in a minute or two and join that up. I want to work on the bottom shapes. So that is a neutral tint with a little bit of French Ultra dropped in, so it cools it down. And that is a little bit of burnt sienna for the slightly warmer bits that might show through. So yes, here I want her legs, not entirely, but largely, to sort of melt into the shadows along the bottom of the painting. I think that's sort of working. Sorry for my silence. I'm concentrating a little bit here, trying to solve some painting problems on the fly, but it's all working out more or less. Yeah, that will be fine. But now I want to get a larger mop-ish brush and then connect all these dark shapes. So that's some very wet wash of sepia. So I want a very fluid wash coming off of the standing figure across the face of the stairs. And then another shape within that shape of the architectural element here. Brings me to one of my favorite topics, dark shapes. If you want a shape to read all as dark, you don't necessarily need to feel obligated to make that entire shape gray, dark, heavy. I think it works quite well if you make the edge crisp and dark, but then within that darker shape, you can introduce lighter, warmer, maybe even unexpected color, and you end up with a shadow area, for example, that looks much more luminous and lively than just a big, ugly, dark gray shape. So the shadow that the standing figure is casting across the face of the steps, I started it in deep violets and blues, and now I'm washing it out into raw umbers. So it's much, much lighter, but I hope overall it will hang together and be understood as a shadow shape. But it doesn't have to be a consistent dark or gloomy value is the point. And pretty fluid. Yeah, that's sort of the effect I want. I would like some darker tones just up here where the shadow begins. So while that's still wet, I'm going to take a little French Ultra, drop it in around her feet. A little bit up the edge of this architectural balustrade. Play around with the tilt of the board. Some gravity going to pull some of these darker cools in and around this wet, warm wash. Yeah, it's just fun to do. You can pull it, let it run left or right, up or down. You get some of these really can be really beautiful effects of one color transitioning into another, a warm transitioning very organically into a cool, for example, can be quite compelling. Don't know if I should do this, but I'm dropping in a little of that teal. I confess to being a little addicted to this teal. It's not that dark, so I'm only concerned that it will lighten up those dark areas too much. But I think it doesn't. I think it's fine. Yeah, I think that's good. So here that's still quite wet, so I'm using gravity just to, again, additional gravity will pull the wet pigment water solution quicker across the surface of the page, depending on which way you tilt it. So it makes those transitions happen more gradually, or however you want. If you want them to look abrupt, you can flatten the board. If you want them to look more gradual, give the board more gravity. Here I'm developing a little blossom. Hardly the end of the world, but I don't really want it. Okay, so yep, we're not done, but some of representation of all the major values are established. The lightest lights here and here. The midtones largely here, and the darkest darks here. I can see already I'd like to isolate this zone as the brightest of the brights. So I want to knock down the light here and there. Not hard to do, but I can see that I'm going to want to do that. And that, in this case, was a benefit of my sort of establishing all the major areas of value before I was done. So even though this column wants to be dark, the top of this column is out of the center of focus. So I don't mind if it fades off the page a little bit. And if the value recedes a little, that's fine. All to the good, actually. So that's just sepia. A little light warm there as a light streak. Doesn't really matter. And then ultramarine, neutral tint for this edge of that column. So again, this isn't completely done, but the establishment of the basic dark value, I think, is successful, and some of these darker cool tones with the darker warm tones merging, little hot spots of warm, just enliven that overall dark shape. So again, it doesn't look like it's cut out or too flat. It looks, it feels, I think, a little more realistic. I was going to say it looks more realistic, but that's not true. It just feels a little more realistic. Now the back side of this balustrade, I want to also paint it now and try to blend it into the figure a little. This is a beautiful high quality flat brush by Escoda, Perla series. They have a very crisp edge, so really ideal for doing that kind of painting if you need to do that kind of painting. They're also ideal for dry brush work if you're as into that as I seem to be. Now the dodgy bits here are this fancy classical balustrade, and how hung up do we really want to get on that? So hopefully not very. So I'm going to try to use this small 1/8" Escoda Perla flat to just take a deep breath and indicate rather than render a lot of the major shapes without stressing too much that it looks absolutely realistic. I don't even think that's desirable, let alone a good idea. I also don't think it's bad if one looks a little different than another. They might pick up light a little differently one to the next. I do think it's bad if they look too defined, too specific. Your work can really quickly, well, I'll speak for myself, my work can really quickly start to look a little too relentlessly architectural or technical, and if that's what you want, that can be good. But if you're going for an overall more fluid feeling, that can be a downside. So again, I'm always going for that mixture of technical precision and loose fluidity. If I do it right and they mix within the same painting, those two painting approaches, I think my work can be at its best. If I emphasize details and specificity too much, yeah, my work can begin to look dry and academic. Conversely, if I'm too loose overall, too fluid overall, that is a way of painting, that's a beautiful way of painting that works for many, but I think I'm not at my best when I try to paint in that style. I'm always looking for ways of merging alternate things on the surface of the paper. Light versus dark, warm versus cool, horizontal versus vertical, the real versus the imagined, on I could go. But also when it comes to just technically how I put paint on the paper, the very loose, the very fluid, and the slightly more controlled and technical, that combination is, I think, where my work can shine if I'm lucky. Okay, so now I have a pretty good overview of the value story of the whole painting. As I said a moment ago, I really want to emphasize this area as being the lightest light. So that tells me that this bit of the stairway, all this in the back, doesn't want to get dark, but it wants to be knocked back just a little to help isolate more and pop out that light. So to do that, I don't know, there's a million ways to get there, but I think I will use just this 3/4 inch flat brush, not a dark wash, but a little bit of raw umber mixed with a little bit of that permanent orange, and I'm going to try to paint it in a somewhat more intentionally sloppy way with just some vertical streaks. So where it leaves some highlights like that, I think is not only not a bad thing, I think that's a good thing. Yeah, but already just that slight lighter tone has begun to isolate more effectively the area of lightest light that I wanted. And here's some violet. It's a little bit more neutral tint in it than I would like, but it's okay. Tone down the sides of these columns as well. So yes, the intention wasn't to kill any of the light, but to help focus it, tone it down a little up here. Some highlights by just some light lifting. I think even this area could be knocked back ever so slightly. I'm just going to use this some of that orange mixed with raw umber in the palette. Just some irregular shards of tone coming down. Again, really helps highlight the light here. All that I think was necessary, but the downside of my having done that is some of the areas I've already painted, I'm going to need to darken them a bit, especially these, to pull them forward of all that. And I definitely will want to come back in there and add a little bit more identity. Similarly, I think along the front of these stairs, in a lighter way, I want to reduce a little bit of the amount of light. Yeah, pretty good. So now I can really see this light here shining, as my sketch indicated. But yeah, the tops of these more forward elements are going to have to be picked out and pulled forward again a little bit. So at this stage, I'm beginning to see the end. I think all the basic values are much more successfully established. Now comes the the part where I just need to balance the values within the structure I already have. Not that hard to do. I'm gonna go back to my mid-size flat brush. This is a little bit of raw umber with a bit of sepia mixed in. Hopefully this isn't too dark. No, I think that's fine. And I want to just, like I was saying earlier, beef up this rhythm of verticals as it steps down the stairs so that I get this reading more clearly forward. Not as much, not as much. So just balancing out the values a little bit. Same story on this one, but with a little less water, a little more pigment. Glint of light through these columns, so I'm going to try to preserve that. And obviously here as well. The front face of that column will be in light. So I was a little ambivalent if I wanted to give it any color, but I think it needs just a little of the lightest warm. To pull it away visually from what's happening there. I think that looks okay, but this needs to be light, so I need to feather those two values a little more skillfully. Yes, that'll work. So I'm pretty certain you can see that I'm not painting by using the reference photo or trying to make this look exactly like it does in so-called reality, of which I'm not always a fan. What I'm trying to do is make decisions based on my painting. Does it look good in the painting? Does it make the painting better? That's where I will adjust a value, a color, tone, and edge. It's all about the painting. It's not about copying. It's not about copying at all. And of course, it just reminds me of my crusade against using reference photos when we paint. I get it, it's almost unavoidable. But when and if you do, just never stop reminding yourself that they're a starting point. They're not the Bible. You don't have to follow everything in that reference photo just because it's there. That's just a suggestion. The reality of your painting is what matters, not the reality of a reference photo. Especially more modern digital photographs, they just have a way of unifying every value, every color. Everything looks as important as everything else. It can make it really difficult, even for a very, very seasoned painter, to design their own painting because they're seduced by this shape or that color or something in a digital photograph that's going to be virtually impossible to replicate and a bad idea in the first place. So if you use reference photos, use them to get a start, an idea perhaps, then hide them. I hide them from myself, because midway in my painting, if I start looking at my reference photo, I'm doomed because I immediately subconsciously see how far I've wandered, and I'll start thinking I've made a horrible mistake when in fact I haven't necessarily done any such thing. So the rhythm of values is starting to work better. It's a little disappointing that this needs to get darker, but not surprising because the value on the standing woman is good, but it's so strong, it's obviously weaker than the column. So at least the base of this column needs to approach the value story on that, our heroine there. I don't want a lot of fussy detail, but she is kind of one of the stars of our show, so I'm giving her a little more attention than I might normally. I just really want the bottom part of her figure to blend in a little bit into the shadows so that it'll highlight the top part of her figure. While I'm up here, I think I'll take some of this fairly fluid raw umber and add just a hint, and I really hope just a hint of some additional identity back here. A little of this will go a long way, and super easy to overdo it. So I always try to get the values correct on my first pass. Do I always? Obviously not. No, I don't. Sometimes I do. I really wished I nailed the values here because I liked a lot of the effects that were created, the warms and cools bleeding together. But all that aside, the value of this area is far more important than anything else. So all those cool effects really won't matter if the value is wrong, and it wasn't wrong, it just wasn't nailed. Here I do want to show a little glint of color between the two columns with a little bit of light that might be peeking through. So this is just a bead of orange. It won't be that definitive, I don't want it to be, but I just want a little sparkle there. So this is some neutral tint, some sepia, some French ultramarine. That messy little knuckle was not really on purpose, but I kind of like it because it just illustrates that collision of the two columns with a tiny bit of light that might be peeking through. So I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to go a little heavier with some of this teal because everything else is at a darker register now. Paint right over her feet. The backside of this railing could be, if not consistently darker here and there, at least as it intersects the figure. So yeah, I'm glad I did this. It needed the value, but also it helped to integrate the figure into the shadow, not just for the effect, but for the whole identity of the painting. Connecting your dark shapes is important. Connecting your light shapes, connecting your dark shapes. It doesn't mean they all have to physically touch, but they have to be in a design where they all are speaking to each other, where they all relate, and they're not just scattered without thought all over the surface of the paper. So here I'm just feathering out those darker tones into somewhat lighter with some violet and a little bit of raw umber. This is an unadvised thing to do, to wash over another wash that has irregular shapes. You find yourself trying to match them and only has moderate success. So I'm just going to feather it out with my finger, keep the values mostly situated up here where they really will do me the most good. So I'm not 100% done, but I think I'm going to stop recording because my videos have gotten a little too long and cumbersome. So I want to keep this at an hour and a half. All that said, there isn't that much more I intend to do to this painting. I think it needs to get fairly good and dry. I could see adding a little bit more identity of value to these columns in this shadow at the top, but not much, just a little. And I think I might even want to tone down this upper part of the stairs just a bit more. But again, not too much. Obviously I have to paint in the figures in the back, but that's a small thing. So I, of course, I'll post this online on my socials, but also as the thumbnail here on YouTube, so you can see it 100% done. But as far as any kind of learning lesson, just about everything is included. The whole idea of trying to create this illusion of depth and perspective is not just a matter of being able to draw in perspective. That helps. But to be able to layer values is a much more effective way. I think it's a beautiful photo, but even this digital photo doesn't really illustrate the depth of distance and expanse this grand space has. Whereas this painting, even not at 100% completion, really starts to tell that story a lot more effectively. As always, my value studies are invaluable to me just to understand where I'm going to go. It doesn't mean I won't make changes to them or alterations as they proceed, but just to have a general overview of what I intend. My intention helps me enormously. So if I would suggest anything, I'd always suggest doing one of these. It helps you break out of the reality of a photograph or even if you're drawing on site, it helps you decide what your intention is, what your center of focus should be, what you want to highlight, what you want to play down, and just gives you a general overall roadmap so that you'll be able to paint with a lot more freedom and a bit more joy without holding your breath and struggling so much. And yeah, so anyway, thank you so much for watching. Again, I will post this 100% done a little later, but I appreciate your time and your company. See you all soon.